There are certain tortures Guibert describes Thomas doing that I can't mention here because of the YouTube content
Oh,
filter,
wow.
which should give you a pretty good idea of what we're dealing with. What I can tell you is that he liked to hang guys up by their thumbs and by other things, and he would often leave prisoners in his dungeons to starve to death. What's interesting is,
You guys ever dislocated your thumb? Bro, y'all know how bad that shit hurts? Dislocating or just hitting your thumb the wrong way, bro. Like getting that hang by your thumbs, or other thing.
sometimes I watch old movies and I wonder, like, before cameras and DNA forensics and everything we have now, wasn't it way easier to get away with crime?
Yes. This video is about the this video this video is about medieval times. Bro, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, bro, you could probably shoot somebody as long as you could probably walk down the street, shoot somebody, walk away. And if nobody's seen it, bro, you're not getting caught. You're not getting caught. And honestly, even if somebody did see, it's gonna take a long time for you to get caught, because it's all word of mouth type of stuff. So medieval, bro, I could only imagine.
Which led me to also wonder, how would you even catch a criminal in, say, the Middle Ages, unless you literally caught him red-handed, which finally led me to a single conclusion: damn, medieval Europe must have been a fantastic place to be a complete psychopath. I mean, think about it. This is a world where your entire identity is based on oaths and what other people think of you from a reputation perspective. So if you're a psychopath, let's just get a loose definition here, that means you don't really have a conscience the way other people do, you don't feel empathy or guilt, and you don't show the physiological stress responses that the rest of us can't really suppress when we lie.
Okay, from this definition of a psychopath, the guy who ambushed the firefighters, he may not be a psychopath by the definition of it, but that man was crazy, bro. For somebody to do that, he was crazy. Y'all go watch that video. I'll probably link it in the description as well.
Modern psychology actually has a name for this general profile. Maybe you've heard of the dark triad, which is narcissism, Machiavellianism, the obsessive need to control and manipulate, and then psychopathy, which comes with all the behavioral and biological signatures I just described. That alarm system that goes off in your brain when you're caught in a lie, like when your stomach drops, that just doesn't fire in a person that has these traits. I'm simplifying things a bit here, but medieval society was...
Bro, that's so hard to wrap my head around, that like somebody can just not feel guilt or just any of the feelings that basically, I'm not gonna say what makes us human, bro, but like it's a big part of you being human. You feeling guilt, feeling empathy, feel all of these feelings, bro. That is crazy.
Essentially held together by two things: mutual trust and a mutual fear of God. If you didn't care about any of that, you could just kind of be a monster. I mean, look at Thomas de Marle. He was a pretty prominent French lord in the early 12th century, and on paper, he was kind of the ideal knight. He was a war hero, veteran of the First Crusade. He actually fought at the Siege of Jerusalem. I mean, I can't really imagine the things this guy saw. So Thomas gets back from Crusade, and he gets in with this whole class of castle-holding nobles who are terrorizing the lands of King Louis VI, also known as Louis the Fat, which is kind of a mean name for somebody who is just trying to impose order. Also, just a side note, for much of the Middle Ages, the figure of the king hadn't developed into this strong, centralized source of power yet, especially in France. So the king was constantly struggling with the noble lords for power, and that was pretty par for the course.
You know, now that he said that, I've always wondered like how the concept of a king, like he said, like one central figure that holds, well, in medieval times, that holds all the power. I always wondered where that came from. Like, because at the end of the day, we're humans. It's like people got to listen to this king. And even the people who are listening to this king and following his orders, it's like, if they don't want to follow your orders, they could just not, you know? So like, I always wondered where that that idea, that concept came from, and where the loyalty came from too. It's probably got some to do with religion.
Now, out of this terrible crew of nobles who was giving Louis problems, Thomas was by far the worst. During this period, the whole idea of chivalry was kind of being born. The church was pushing movements like the peace of God that basically established that a knight should never attack churches or the people inside them, clergy, women, peasants, anybody who can't defend themselves. And the way the church enforced the peace of God was the threat of excommunication. So if you break the peace and attack innocent people, you get excommunicated. And if you die excommunicated, well, as far as anybody in the
Did not I just say it? Has something to do with religion. And it's like, I guess, honestly, back then, that's probably the best way to get people to follow, not even follow orders, but to get people to fear something, But that's crazy, though.
Middle Ages was concerned, that was basically a one-way ticket to hell. But wouldn't you be totally immune to that if you just didn't believe in hell or you didn't really care the way everyone else did? That was Thomas. He just ignored all of it. The clergy weren't safe. Pilgrims got plundered on the road. He loved terrorizing peasants from the villages of rival lords, sort of a weekend hobby for him to let off some steam.
Jeez.
We actually have a
Yo.
first-hand account from a monk named Guibert of Nogent, who was unlucky enough to live near Thomas, and he wrote about him with this insane, genuine horror. There are certain tortures Guibert describes Thomas doing that I can't mention here because of the YouTube content filter, which should give you a pretty good idea of what we're dealing with. What I can tell you is that he liked to hang guys up by their thumbs and by other things, and he would often leave prisoners in his dungeons to starve to death. What's interesting is,
You guys ever dislocated your thumb? Bro, y'all know how bad that shit hurts. Dislocating or just hitting your thumb the wrong way, bro. Like getting that hang by your thumbs, or other thing. Let's keep going.
I said, the whole idea of the chivalrous knight is developing at this time. So contemporary writers use Thomas as the poster child for everything a chivalrous knight shouldn't be. A knight was supposed to embody wisdom and charity and loyalty and honor. And Thomas was the representation of pride, false swearing, lechery, and treason. Now, you might be sitting there wondering, how does anybody get away with this for decades, even in the Middle Ages? Well, you could just kind of swear an oath that you wouldn't do it anymore, and then even if you did start doing it again quietly, communication was slow and information kind of moved at a trickle, so you could usually get away with it for a while. Also, if you're biologically incapable of feeling fear or guilt, then really an oath is just words. You're basically immune to medieval society's primary law enforcement mechanism. But the big question still remains here, why was medieval society so vulnerable to these personality types? Like, people were smart and perceptive then too. Nobody noticed the big old blind spot here. Well, the problem was that they actually couldn't. Medieval philosophy had this concept called synderesis, which was written about extensively by thinkers like Albertus Magnus, who you might know as Thomas Aquinas' teacher. Synderesis is the absolute belief that God has hardwired a moral compass into every single human soul. It's the divine spark, the natural weight that's constantly pulling every man, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, towards the good, towards the light of the Lord. Now, we understand from modern psychology that not everybody feels the pull of conscience the same way. Synderesis is basically saying the exact opposite, that everybody does have the same conscience installed by God. So no matter how wicked a man is, deep down he still feels guilt like everyone else. To the medieval mind, a human being with...
Bro, that is... obviously, we're watching this video, but that is a dangerous slope to ride on, bro. Very dangerous.
Without a conscience was a biological and theological impossibility, so it wasn't even conceived of. It's the perfect camouflage, and if you're a Patrick Bateman type maneuvering through high medieval society, you could just fake the entire language of honor. I've mentioned this in other videos, but public displays of emotion, weeping at mass, these big dramatic acts of piety were seen as proof of how serious you were about God. So the psychopath could just perform. You weep on cue, you kiss the relic, the wolf stays hidden in sheep's clothing. You might be imagining this whole scenario playing out in some isolated farming village, the type of place most people lived in the Middle Ages, and it did, and we'll get there.
Yo, that is so scary. I just thought about that. Like, people lived so far away from each other in the Middle Ages. Like you said, isolated farmlands, bro. This man Tomas roll up in your on your property, bro. You were grits, kid. Bro, there's nothing you could do. Oh my gosh.
But sometimes two guys, two apex predators at the top of the food chain would be pulling this on each other, and it would become this high-level game of chicken, which I guess is what politics still is today. I mean, just look at the bitter, decades-long rivalry between the handsome ginger King Henry II of England and King Louis VII of France in the 12th century. They got caught up in this constant cycle of brutal border wars that could only be ended by these massive, highly emotional peace summits. And I mean, they're both weeping and swearing holy oaths of eternal brotherhood on sacred relics. They're exchanging the kiss of peace in front of God and the assembled nobility of both kingdoms. And then a few weeks later,
that's why psychopaths are so scary, bro. They can probably really like act. They can act. It's just an act to them. They can act normal, so normal, bro. But it's just an act. Like, oh brother, that is crazy, man.
they're breaking the oaths without a second thought whenever it becomes politically.
Like, your next door neighbor could be a psychopath, bro. Let's be for real. Your next door neighbor. Matter of fact, yeah. Someone you know very close to you could be a psychopath. Just putting on an act, bro.
Convenient. Henry's own sons, Richard and John, repeatedly swore fealty to their father and then teamed up with the French, first with Louis and then with his even craftier son, Philip Augustus, to hunt Henry down, which caused him a ton of problems near the end of his life. So it's like for everyone else, the oath is a cosmic contract, but if you're at the top, you're really only upholding it because breaking it might trigger consequences you can't control. That actually might be kind of the worst part of all of it, because it means the system's biggest vulnerability wasn't just for a few hidden monsters. The entire class running the system kind of understood that the sacred stuff was negotiable while everybody else was staking their entire lives on it. And then it's kind of a slippery slope from there, because if you're thinking that way, then
I will say, bro, I'm not gonna go too much into it, but it's a lot like that to this day, bro. With many religions, especially Christianity.
Peace treaty is really
just my opinion. I mean, you gotta get into it.
Just a convenient way to get all of your unarmed enemies into one room. But I want to go back to Synderesis and the medieval scholars for a second. You're telling me, John, that not even someone as smart as Thomas Aquinas figured out that there were a few people floating around without the same conscience as everyone else? Well, actually, kind of, and of course it was Aquinas who came up with it. He worked through this whole categorization of evil, and he concluded that normal people sin in two understandable ways. They sin out of ignorance or they sin out of passion. So weakness, rage, temptation, crimes committed in the heat of the moment. Medieval society would, of course, punish those sins, but it could also comprehend them, and to a certain extent, it could forgive them. But then, Aquinas actually carved out a third category for a type of person that hadn't even really been conceived of before: the people who sin ex militia, from malice. Or as he put it, the people who sin with certain knowledge. This is the cold-hearted, clear-headed killer who's planning it ahead of time and knows exactly what he's doing. He's not blinded by rage. It's not like this moment of temptation, or he comes home and he catches his wife in bed with a local jester. This is what we would describe today as pathological behavior. Aquinas said that—
I ain't gonna lie, that is very interesting, bro. And I'm not gonna lie, philosophy in general now is really interesting to me, and maybe it's because I watched Joe Bart. Shout out Joe. But like, philosophy in general is really interesting to me. And that, like, yeah, for a philosopher to have thought of that concept back then, and it's like we've been asking that question too. Like, you're saying none of these philosophers, none of these smart people figured out that there's some psychopaths running around. That is crazy. That back then he was able to, think of that.
These types know exactly what the laws of God and man are, and they just run a little cost-benefit analysis and choose to do the atrocity anyway, because the payout in land or gold or power outweighs the spiritual penalty that they probably don't believe in anyway. The problem with all of this is that by the time theologians were starting to come to terms with the idea of this type of person existing, these psychopaths were already embedded deep in a system that basically rewarded them. Because in a lot of ways, the feudal system kind of selected shifted in favor of guys like Thomas de Marle. There's this great medievalist, Chris Wickham. If you haven't read his book, Medieval Europe, I highly recommend it. He writes that feudal society was essentially built on the constant threat of violence. Violence that the lords could perpetrate on the peasants with armed men, violence from peasant uprisings, etc., etc. So people who were genuinely afraid of violence had little chance of long or successful lives, and they usually ended up joining the church if they could. But men who weren't afraid to do a little violence were at a huge advantage. I think there's a risk here that we can read someone like Thomas the wrong way. There's this misconception.
So you were incentivized to be crazy back then. Well, not necessarily crazy. No. Bro, who likes violence? That is crazy.
That psychopaths are just totally out of their minds and foaming at the mouth or whatever. It's actually scarier, at least in my opinion, because Thomas was totally level-headed and rational. He's the type of guy Thomas Aquinas is talking about. In 1114, a church council formally condemned him, anathematized him, which means banished him from the church, and stripped him of his knightly belt. But he just didn't show up to this ceremony. Louis the Fat personally led armies against his castles and
why did he change it to Louis the Big Boned, bro? I respect it, I guess, bro.
Even with all of this, it still took decades because Thomas was a landed lord in a system that was designed to protect violent landed lords, and he had multiple castles and a whole crew of highly trained armed men around him. He actually wasn't finished off until 1130 when he was mortally wounded while being captured, but that was after 30 years of basically doing whatever he wanted. Now, I know Thomas has kind of been the main character of this video, but I'm still wondering, what if you had all of these traits, but you weren't born into the nobility? You were a peasant like 80% of the population was for most of the Middle Ages. I mentioned earlier that information tended to move really slowly, mostly because the roads were bad and a lot of Europe was covered in dense forests. Word of anything could take weeks to travel, which was bad news if you were trying to get a letter delivered to your beloved, but great news if you were a sociopathic peasant who wanted to travel to a new town and steal someone's identity. Because couldn't you just say you were whoever, and if you were smart enough and confident enough, nobody would have any way to prove you right or wrong? Now, I just said sociopath instead of psychopath, so quick distinction, and this is the pop psychology version, roughly speaking. A psychopath is usually born, not made, while a sociopath is usually made, not born, and they're more impulsive. They're kind of running on the pure audacity of the act, but with the same delusions of grandeur and that Paris.
Let me know in the comments if y'all knew that distinction. I just learned something. Cause I've always thought about what the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath is. That's a pretty clear distinction.
Acidic instinct, which brings us to the false Baldwin of 1225. Baldwin IX, the Count of Flanders, gets crowned Emperor of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. Then he mysteriously vanishes into a Bulgarian prison, and nobody ever finds out what happened to him. 20 years later, a random prison, and nobody ever finds out what happened to him. 20 years later, a random guy dressed in rags comes wandering out of the woods in Flanders, an awfully long way from Bulgaria, claiming to be Baldwin. Through sheer confidence, he basically pulls it off. I mean, towns declared their support for him, nobles kneeled to him. He even sparked a full-blown rebellion against Baldwin's actual daughter, Countess Joan, and he came pretty close to taking control of Flanders with basically nothing but a made-up identity. I kind of wonder how he felt when he realized people were actually going for it. Like, was he thinking, wow, I can't believe this is working? Or was he like, yes, this is exactly what should be happening? I'm not a sociopath, so I'm not sure how that internal monologue goes. Or am I? Anyway, finally, the King of France sits him down and asks him a few simple questions, which you would think he would have done some research on. You know, where were you knighted? Where did you do homage? Obviously, fake Baldwin can't answer these questions and the whole house of cards comes crashing down. All it took was literally one straightforward conversation. He was executed soon after, and later they found—
Oh my God. Wow. He fucked around and found out. That's crazy.
Out that he was most likely a wandering minstrel named Bertrand de Vray. There's also the famous case of Martin Guerre from 1556, which is technically a little outside the Middle Ages, but to a French peasant, 1556 wasn't much different than 1456 or 1356, so we'll roll with it. There's this guy, Arnaud Duty, and he wanders into an isolated French village claiming to be Martin Guerre, a local fella who abandoned his family and disappeared years before. Just like fake Baldwin, he's so confident that everyone just kind of buys it and accepts him into the community. I mean, who would pretend to be Martin Guerre? He even fools Martin's family, which is definitely the fishy part. Like, wouldn't they recognize that he isn't Martin? Apparently, he looked vaguely similar and knew some details about Martin's life, but still.
Okay, this guy was he did a little research.
Fake Martin, aka Martin 2.0, aka Morton, takes over Martin's wife and his property and basically his whole life for years, which again, the wife had to be in on it somehow, but we'll leave that for now. Eventually, people get to talking and fake Martin, aka Morton, is put on trial as an imposter. But for a little while, it seems like he's gonna win the case until one day the doors swing open and the real Martin Guerre comes.
This shit sound like a movie, bro. Oh my god. For years? Nah, the wife had to be in on it, bro. What? Okay, it's the Middle Ages, bro, so I don't really know. But, bro, you took over the man's... For years? The man's wife, kids, family, his property, everything? Oh my god.
Limping into the courtroom on a wooden leg, back from the wars. You probably think I'm making this whole thing up, but this is exactly why history rules. It's better than anything you or I could come up with.
I'm not gonna lie. This is crazy. This bro, this is the type of history they should have taught us. This is the history we should have been learning in school, bro.
This was unfortunately essentially game over for fake Martin, and just like fake Baldwin, he was executed soon after, which seems harsh, but I don't make the rules. The point is, whether you were a peasant or a noble or a sociopath or a psychopath, medieval society basically had these massive vulnerabilities that were waiting to be exploited. With that said, let's put the finishing touches on this medieval masterpiece. Sometimes I see people online yearning for the medieval world. I've been guilty of this myself. You know, when life was simple, when big tech wasn't spying on you.
Who? Let me know in the comments. Who wants to go back to medieval times, bro? What? I'm sure you guys know why, but I don't even want to go back to the 60s, bro. Let alone 14, 13, 60, 17. Bro, what?
You all the time, when you ate what you grew and died if it got too cold out. Honestly, I get it. The past can seem like this beautiful foreign country that you'll never get to visit, and that kind of sucks. But there are massive advantages and disadvantages to living in any time period, and I hate to break it to you, but you were probably born in the right era. This romantic view of the Middle Ages gets tied up with like King Arthur and chivalry and knights and princesses, but look at the reality. Chivalry, for example, existed because the church needed to put a leash on a heavily armed, militarily trained, highly violent upper class. Or I guess in other words, it existed because of the Thomas de Marles of the world, not in spite of them. All of this, of course, begs one final question, which is if these same personality types exist today, which of course they do, what vulnerabilities in our society are they exposing? Let me know in the comments.
You guys let me know what you think about this video. Link will be in the comments or in the description. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.